Thank you so much, Suzanne. It's really wonderful to be invited to give a talk at the library. I want to start off by thanking everyone who's made this possible. The University Library Research Institute has been immensely helpful. Thank you, everyone in the team. All my fellow Munby fellow who's been encouraging throughout the project. I also want to take a moment to thank my beautiful wife, Amber, and my family for coming. They're here in attendance. They never come to my talks. You'll understand why at the end. But I'll go ahead and get started. I also want to thank my faculty, the history faculty, the McDonald Institute for Archaeological Research, Center for Latin American Studies, and all of my faithful supporters here in Cambridge. Just to start off with, I'm an ethnohistorian. I focus on indigenous communities of the Americas. My research is primarily looking at Nahuatl communities. Nahuatls we usually associate with the Aztecs, the name that we usually give this particular group. It's language, I'll talk about that in a moment, but my focus is on the modes of communication that took shape, the roots of how communities wrote, produced knowledge before Spanish colonialism, and how that changed with the interventions by ecclesiastic, enthusiastic evangelists in the 16th century. I'm really interested in the theories. I've got some works up here that sort of I build my work upon. I'm always feeling like I'm standing on top of giants who've done a lot of the groundwork, and I'm just sort of exploiting their amazing resources. The types of materials I'm usually focused on are archaeological. They're manuscripts from the early colonial period. They're indigenous documents, Spanish chroniclers, and as well as my first book focuses in on learning environments and how schools shaped students' lives, but also how these indigenous students shaped the schools that were supposed to change them and correct their sort of behaviors. And in a sense, we actually see local identity taking shape. And this project builds off of that to see how these learning environments, these immersive environments, informed learning. Bless you. So in tonight's talk, I'll just be going through introducing you to the manuscript that I've been working on here in the collection. It's a Nahuatl Latin lectionary that's part of the Bible Society collections. I'll be discussing how we might approach this type of manuscript and what happens when we take a more interdisciplinary strategy to discovering its parameters, its production, its context, its historical context. And I'll talk about the material science that I've been able to participate in with the team here at the library as a Munby Fellow that's helping me build a new project on looking at what I'm calling the Great Aztec Cover-Up. I'll get to that later, and then I'll have some conclusions for you. And I have a lot of slides, so hopefully we'll muscle through. Just to note, I pronounce it Nahuatl, based on the language studies that I do work in. It's language that has a lot of variations across Mexico. Nahuatl speakers today, it's a living language, and it was the lingua franca that Spanish colonizers encountered when they first came to mainland Mesoamerica. It was introduced to alphabetic text in the 1520s, and indigenous people adopted alphabetic text readily. They were really excited to have new forms of communicating, as well as holding on to some of their older traditions. Like I mentioned, it's a living language. There are millions of speakers today, but it is still considered an endangered language. It's really important that we do this type of work across all collections, all archives around the globe, because the archive was dispersed or shifted hands or found new places to sort of exist. And so it's really important that we do this type of work. I work with an indigenous language program, IDEAS, based out of Zacatecas, Mexico, but I've done most of my work in the States with this language program, and I continue to work with my colleagues today to analyze these types of materials. The sort of what's at stake moment when you come to analyzing colonial documents is this moment in which indigenous lives were changed through the introduction of Christianity. I mean, it was a moment of indoctrination, cultural traditions that had been in practice for centuries suddenly needed to be policed and regulated, regimented, And just from these images from Munoz Camargo's History of Tlaxcala, which is in Glasgow right now, you can get a sense of how, in the eyes of an indigenous artist, their lives were changed. They adopted Christianity, they became Christian. When we think about this concept of cultural imperialism and how that changes others' lives, we also have to think about the dynamic ways in which those who are being indoctrinated actually find a new way of existence, an ethnogenesis that is shaped by Christianity. That they become Christian, they also interpret Christianity in their own ways, and I'll have points to that. But just to pull back just a little bit before that moment, we have the world of the Tlaquilo that sort of dominates Mesoamerica at the time. Tlaquilo, or Tlaquiloque, the plural for this type of painter scribe, were the archivists of the Nahuatl world. These are just some examples of the type of romantic visions of the Nahuatl artist at work, creating the archive, creating books, using pictorial writing systems. And we know that men and women were both Tlaquilo. You can see this Tlaquilo here is a female scribe recording her history, and we can see the Spanish gloss in this colonial document that shows they're trying to identify it as a painter, not necessarily that she's a scribe. But we know that this is part of the production of an archive that has changed with Spanish interventions. Normally, I'm working on the Florentine Codex. This is one of the key encyclopedic texts of Mesoamerica, of the Aztecs, of the Nahuatl people. It's written in Nahuatl with a Spanish translation. I'm really interested in the ways in which the modes of communication show up in this text, how these types of materials were created at the time. So a priest would, Bernardino de Sahagún is known to have overseen this project. He would be this sort of priestly figure on the right, your right, or your left, sorry. And then moving over to your right, you'd see the way in which scribes would produce information. They would have interviews with indigenous elders, and then that would be captured in something like the Florentine Codex. Just to give you a quick rundown of what the Florentine Codex consists of, it's written on European paper. It has a Nahuatl original text, a Spanish translation of that Nahuatl text, and then pictorial images, visual writing, and illustrations that Kevin Traciano and others have argued is the third text of the Florentine Codex. I've always been interested in the ways in which these different modes of communication are in conversation together, and also the other material aspects of the volume. We can see here, I went to Florence to study the pasted over panels that are in the Florentine Codex. We don't know what's beneath these panels yet. We haven't had that analyzed yet for 500 years. So I was interested, I have work on Chia and ethnobotanical aspects of the Nahuatls, and I want to know why you cover over this portion. I can talk to you about that in the Q&A if you'd like. But doing work in the archives, sometimes you do feel like you're shedding light on the manuscript, trying to see what's beneath it, see what's behind these panels. You have to be careful because you're not allowed to sort of expose it to certain light. So you could just sort of have it carefully dangled to have one of the curators help you take an image to see what might be behind this or that page, and try and look behind. So that's what type of work that I was doing in Cambridge when I came across the manuscript here in the library. I knew there were Nahuatl materials in the collection. I thought they were mostly microfilm copies of materials that had been sent back to Mexico. That's what staff had sort of indicated. But I knew they were in the Bible Society collection. I knew this is something I had to get involved in. And then in April of 2023, I came across the manuscript. I identified it as being very unique in these types of materials. I'll show you why. And then I applied to get the Munby Fellowship, and then I've had a wonderful time this last year exploring the collection. Onesimus is a fantastic curator of the Bible Society collections, and it's a really important collection that we need to study because there's so many other cultural elements that are wrapped up. It's a worldly collection that was amassed in the 19th century to, in a way, create new lines of communication between people at the same time that it sort of removed some objects from their original communities. So it's really important that we continue to do this work. joining the Hidden in Plain Sight project and having this become part of that important work that's happening at Queen Mary University, London, it's been a really exciting project. So, how was it collected? Who collected it? This is James Thompson on your right there. He's a Scottish reverend who was the colportier, the Bible thumper salesman who was running around the Americas at the time. He was fascinated with education studies. He wanted to spread the gospel, but also to increase education based on Bible studies. He's living and working in South America for 7 years, and then he moves to Mexico for a few years, and then further up to Canada. He's always trying to find purchase in Mexico, and I think it's really important that we think about these types of Bible Society members who have an interest in language, have an interest in collecting, and they actually are they help produce these types of archives that we need to explore today and identify the works that are still in them. Thompson, when he's in South America, he picks up multiple indigenous languages and starts working on translations and prints for the Bible Society. In Mexico, he identifies Nahuatl as an important language, and it's fascinating how it changes his life. And he becomes interested, and we have his materials here to show you some of the ways in which he becomes entangled in the language and the material. But he also had a different opinion at a younger age. In 28, this is from his papers, a letter back home. And he says, you're wondering, he's talking to London, he's saying to the Bible Study officials, you asked if this language is going to become extinct. I could want for nothing more. He says, I'm nothing more desirous of me than to have this go extinct. At the same time, it's crucial that we publish in this language so that we can spread gospel, we can spread the good word, we can educate. But then it's interesting that he goes back to compare it also to other languages in the UK. These other languages, Gaelic, Manx, Irish, Welsh, right? They also ought to be gone. It can have it happen sooner. So it's a really complicated person, right? He's at the same time that he wants to eradicate a language, maybe, or create some sort of conformity about forms of gospels, he's also collecting, identifying the importance of language, and learning about a new culture. And it really does change his identity. It changes him. It creates space for Nahuatl studies in the collection. So he's a really interesting figure. He receives the lectionary, he trades it for a few copies of the Bible from Padre Jose Antonio Lopez Garcia de Salazar. This is a Mexican Catholic priest who's disaffected with the Mexican state. They've just taken shape. It's the new young Mexican Republic. They're trying to shuffle off imperial designs. Their conservatives are trying to hold on to the past, and more liberal figures, intellectuals like Father Jose, he knows that you need to publish in the vernacular. He knows he needs to have printed copies in Nahuatl to spread Christianity. So it's like a liberal way of thinking instead of keeping it in the Latin text. One thing that's interesting about his interactions with Thompson is he's a worldly figure too. He trades this important manuscript, by all accounts, an extremely unique manuscript, for a copy of the translation, the Chinese translation of the Bible and the Arabic Malay translation of the Bible. These are the latest copies. He's trying to understand this Christianity on a global scale. I think it's important to note that from him. Where does the manuscript come before that? We're not sure. He's colleagues with Jose Maria Mora, this intellectual liberal who has a habit of taking books from collections himself. He, for a time, up until 2014, Cambridge was home, the Bible Society was home to one of the most unique histories of the Mexica people, the Aztec, who we think of as the Aztec Empire, the Codex Mexicayot. And it was sold in 2014 and eventually ends up on indefinite loan to Mexico, so coming back to Mexico. But there's no real Christian notion there. It was just to study the language itself. That's why it was collected at the time. But this type of work, the lectionary that I'm going to talk about for the remainder of the talk, it may have been associated with the library of Carlos de Sigüenza y Góngora, famous intellectual and collector in Mexico in the 17th century. who had rescued a bunch of volumes from the Colonial Archive. So we're not sure exactly where the volume was at one point, but we know that Padre Jose trades it for these translations. This is just to give you a lay of the land. This is the body of lectionaries that we know of existence from the dated roughly to the 16th century. A copy in Chicago, Mexico City, in Milan, and that's the one that had the most work done before now. In 2013, this about a year before the Codex Mexicayo leaves the Bible Society collection, there's the discovery of another lectionary in Toledo, and then now we have this latest lectionary. It's extremely unique compared to the others because it's the only one with Mesoamerican symbols in its illuminated letters. So this is an illuminated capital letter from the lectionary that's before you. And in the other volumes, I'll show you in a moment what their illuminations look like, but they're much more the traditional European style. So among the lectionary, among these epistolarium and evangeliarium, this is a really interesting volume to be studying right now. This is just to show you the list of those that I had just put in front of you, and also to note that there are some that are still considered missing. A copy that was at one point in the British Museum Library. My colleague Ben Leeming is doing a lot of work to try and locate all of these missing Gospels and Nahuatl Gospels. So it's a really important project to be working on right now because we're trying to locate all this larger corpus. Quickly, just to give you a sense of where it comes from, this is a map of Mexico City, roughly 1550. Up close, you can see one of the first schools, the Colegio de Santa Cruz Tlatelolco, that was home to some of these indigenous scribes who had converted to Christianity and started producing Nahuatl materials. These environments, like I said, were immersive. They could inform the way that scribes would produce materials. And for instance, they could go when they had to go collect water from the cistern in the plaza, sit down at the cistern that you can go see today in Mexico City, where they've recovered the murals that were around the cistern that actually have a Mesoamerican idyllic scene of the lake surrounding the city of Tenochtitlan, but these are done in the colonial period. So we see like the immersive environment connecting visually both the students' lives within the schools and without. Going there, this may be the location where this type of manuscript was produced, in the studia under figures like Bernardino de Sahagún. Here's the manuscript itself. It's in the catalog as a Nahuatl Latin lectionary. The chapter headings are in Latin, in a red vermilion, and the body text is in iron gall ink. Who wrote it? We're not sure. I'm still trying to uncover that. I'm trying to match the writing, the handwriting. Could it be Europeans who are learning Nahuatl and trying to create a text, essentially a text for students? Or could it be these students who, by all accounts, Sahagún mentioned, his students are so well read in Latin that they can teach it to the Spaniards. So these could be the writings of these well-learned students of the Colegio, the collegians, who are producing this type of manuscript. The use would be to contain all the lessons that had been agreed upon by the Council of Trent in the 1540s. So essentially a curriculum that had been established of readings, biblical passages, to help either the congregation or individuals connect with this sort of deeper messages on a daily, weekly, and on festival holidays. Again, it's unique because it's visual qualities. I'm happy to report that it's now available, thanks to the staff's hard work, available online. You can go and look at the manuscript in all its entirety, zoom in on the high quality images to find some of these exciting material elements for yourself. Please do take a look. And what's exciting about this type of opportunity is to increase access for Mexicans today, to actually bring them in some ways closer to the volume, to increase access for Bible Society members to know what's in the collection. Overall, to get scholars a chance, enthusiasts, to understand connections between this type of work and today's Catholic communities or Christian communities today. This is the type of work that some of the boring stuff that I do is sort of do transcription work to help us search through the manuscript, and then translations provided to help people navigate through the text, find particular passages, and understand what's unique, what's distinct about this particular manuscript. This will help you kind of understand the hands that were involved. Okay. After analyzing the paleography, I can roughly say that this is the portioning of the work that went into the production. The number of hands may be roughly around 12 to 13. Some portions you can see a consistency in which they were producing these folios, and then just others. Some were more heroes in the effort who would produce lots of material for this particular volume. Otherwise, another important element is that these glyphs, these visual elements, are only in the first portion of the manuscript. So that hand, that individual, that author, had some closer connection to these decorative elements than others. Doing work on the paper itself is really crucial. Understanding where the paper comes from, so that we understand the deeper resonance of having these visual images or these other elements incorporated in it. This is European paper, so these glyphs are written on Christian European paper, introducing that type of decorative element to the manuscript. Based on the filigree, based on what I can see, and more work needs to be done, this helps us push the dating earlier, potentially, to the 1570s, instead of what it was assumed to be the early 17th century. So that's important. When we analyze the visuals themselves, we can link them to pre-colonial manuscripts. So we have examples of Mesoamerican manuscripts on the screen here. This is the Codex Borgia in the Vatican Library. It's fully digitized, so it makes analyzing the visual elements helpful, useful. After studying these, I can identify roughly 11 to 13 distinct symbols. They do have meaning in pictorial writing forms, from concepts of fertility, change, great change. The other lectionaries use this, like I mentioned, this European style of illumination. So our volume is extremely important. It's very unique. Looking up close, as I said, you have symbols for ehekat, the symbol for wind, bifurcated shell, chalchihuit, jade bead for preciousness, shells for fertility that are associated with water in the lacustrine area of Lake Texcoco, the watery area of the city of Mexico. We know that the style of producing these types of artwork match what we see in pre-colonial forms of art. And in fact, based on working with scholars and in conversation with scholars in archaeology, I found patterns in the Borgia Codex that replicate this three-symbol pattern, especially in women's regalia, women's clothing, the huipil, the skirt, having this embroidery. One of my colleagues and I have come up with this idea that it's a way of amplifying the Christian text at the fringe, at the edge of the page itself. So when it's introducing that passage with that large capital letter, it's doing so in an indigenous way as well as a Christian way. So that's kind of exciting to come to. But now the kind of exciting bit, what we're all sort of here to see is what this plain white material is that I mentioned in the talk, in the title. MS 375 is full of a white paint through every hand in the manuscript. Some use it more than others. It corrects the passage, it corrects the page. It may have been applied with a deer hair brush. That would have been a Mesoamerican way of applying this type of material to a manuscript, and I'll get to that soon. But it also may have been a colonial implement that was used. When I first saw it, I thought, what is it? I knew that there was the use of gypsum or lime in pre-colonial manuscripts. I wanted to know more. What was the binding agent? What was it? It's hard to see, but maybe you saw this bit there, right? There's also more on the page. It's really challenging to see if it's in that little crook of the book itself. just a little moment of spot the dot. You may have seen this one up here. You may see these two down here. What we know is some of it is very sophisticated, very fine changes to the manuscript itself to correct the alphabetic text. Some are very blatant. When I first opened up 375, I thought to myself, how dare Reverend Thompson feel so audacious as to correct a 16th century manuscript? Why would he use Tipex on this old manuscript? Tipex is not patented until 1960. The first liquid correctives don't come out until 1940s. That would have been 100 years before that was done. But no, these are from the 16th century. These are sophisticated corrections in a Christian manuscript by likely indigenous scholars to make the passage matter more for the reader. You can muck around easily to make sort of some of these more visible, but we're working on ways with computer-aided design to identify them in a much more effective way. Finding this Aztec Tipex, this material in the manuscript, opened up a new sort of line of inquiry, and I've now been searching for it in other manuscripts. When I went to the archive in Toledo, it was in the volume in Toledo, so I know that it's being used in this corpus. It's in at least two others. It's not in the more cherished volume that's in the Ayer collection at the Newberry Library. That one is known to be written in the hand of Sahagún. So we know that Sahagún wasn't using this technology, or at least not in that volume. But it helps us show that it's part of a larger conversation. And in fact, that conversation is really large, and it was only by studying the material itself that we could identify how it fits into this larger process. So working with the team here, we've been able to do analysis of the manuscript. This has been conservation driven to make it so that we're protecting the manuscript, making sure that these material visual elements last, identifying how to protect it best. CHIL, the Cultural Heritage Imaging Lab, has been essential. Working with Flavia Fiorillo on this throughout has been a fantastic experience to recover these technologies. And I won't focus on all of these techniques that we worked on, just to highlight some. The use of reflectance to identify the material. We can see that it gave off the key signature for gypsum, and in doing that work, we were able to identify this. As gypsum, the white material, we know that the red ink is based off of vermilion. Vermilion was a common ink used in Mesoamerica as well as in Europe, so that's sort of to be anticipated. But in Mesoamerica, they used gypsum for their books. The Tlaquiloque used this type of material for their books too. So it's really exciting to have this type of analysis done to help understand how corrections took place in this whole conversation. So instead of just a priest sort of dictating what to go do and the elder telling the scribe what to do, when it comes to the production of some of these early colonial manuscripts, the scribe becomes a crucial agent of change at the moment of producing these. There's a moment of erasure, correction, editing, editorializing that maybe we don't really think about. We also often think about the scribe as being maybe almost like an artificial intelligence being sent to do a job and produce this work for us. No, the scribe is very human. It makes choices and corrections, needs to make it correct. With close-up scans of the material, we can find, what's hidden beneath. Also, what's hidden inside, right? So I don't know if you can see from where you're sitting. Maybe I'll make it bigger for you, but there's human hair stuck in the white material. This was done at the time that this material was pasted into the manuscript. To understand that better, we'd have to damage it. We'd have to damage it in a way to understand the genetics, the DNA. I don't think it's worth it to do that. It's there, it's presence. It means that this is done in situ at the moment. But finding this material in MS 375 had me looking elsewhere, and you begin to see it in a lot of material. We have examples from Mesoamerica, a large collection of materials where they would use gypsum or lime to make corrections. In the Europe theater, we see it used in illuminated letters. You may have seen it underneath some of the gilding in manuscripts. But we don't see any of it in the other forms of correction. Usually correcting text in Europe is rubbing, is diluting. pasting over sometimes. I have found a few examples of use of white paint, and I'll show you that in a moment. But for the colonial element, these are all manuscripts made in the colonial period around the same time as this that include evidence of these erasures and paint over portions. And that's why I'm sort of going towards this great Aztec cover-up to highlight that. I'll sort of move through these quickly, only because to get to the last bit, but just to identify that this is the tradition that in the Americas, the Tlaquilo would prime the animal hide or maguey or fig bark paper with a white substance, and then varnish it with white to protect the paint on the inside. The books were called emotionally. They would prime. This little parenthetical that's missing was to mention that there was a regional variation. In some areas in the east they would use gypsum, in the west they would use this chalk, the lime, the organic chalk. These are just examples of some of the volumes that have been studied and analyzed. And here up close, the Borgia that I've been looking at especially, you can kind of see some of the corrections to the rabbit head and its ear, some notions of where there was an original scribal mark for the elbow. This is 200 years before Spaniards show up in the Americas, so it's a process that's in place in the Americas. From the Codex Borbonicus, we can see examples, or glaring examples of the use of white material to coat these pages and correct them. The European theater, again, I mentioned this, I showed this manuscript here in the collection. When they went to deface the portion about St. Thomas in reaction to Benedict, oh my goodness, I just spaced my comment. When they went to correct this passage, they wiped out the gold that was over the white paint here, over the illuminated letters. That shows us that they were using this gesso to connect the folio, the gilding to that manuscript. The Aesop fables that I have highlighted, it's a copy from Germany. What's fascinating is it shows us some of the similarities to the Mesoamerican tradition of correcting painted over manuscripts. For example, in this passage where we see the hunter meeting with the pastoralist in this particular fable, we can see how they made the correction from page to page to shift the illustration over, and you can see changes in how the figures are laid out. So in the Mesoamerican sense, what does this mean? What do we call this material? That's one of the questions that the Chill group has been discussing. I've been working with my Nahuatl colleagues. Nahuatls had a term they called shield-like chalk, or they called stone-like chalk, that would coat materials and protect them. I like that notion, this type of shielding or protecting with stone. But looking in the Florentine Codex, there's actually more evidence that it was a specific type of color that was used, or a way of talking about color. When you look at the Florentine Codex, you can actually see Tipex, this Aztec Tipex, in use in this folio, where you see the artists have told you how they whiten manuscripts. They show you a panel with a root system that's been whited out with this white paint. So it's a three-dimensional, essentially a fourth text in the Florentine Codex. And then they paint over with these, to paint these white bowls over, showing you how they might reuse or correct a panel. What do we call white, right? When my wife and I we're moving, we need to look for new paints for a home. We have to find a particular white that calls to us. And we have so many ways, so many options of what we call a white. And I think about, Wittgenstein's logic games about color and trying to identify, a particular cultural group. Could we ever understand blue-green, the Gru color of the Maya, in the same way that they did? Could we ever understand, what's your favorite, Scotland Road, in the same way that whoever came up with that color did? Well, it's important to me to find what Nahuatls called this term, because they were the ones using it. In the Florentine Codex, we have Iztacpaltic is the descriptive way in which you would describe this white or whitening. Just to highlight, it's a snowy white, a fuzzy white is how they would call it. We might think it was like a flat white, but there was actually texture in there in the Nahuatl connotation of colors. One of the first things you have that happens in Nahuatl class sometimes is you'll deal with colors. And I remember my first day in Nahuatl school, Jeff Pine came up to me and he said, "What's your favorite color for white?" And we went through all these different types of white notions. So it's something that's really important to the living language today, to understand the living language, to understand the past. And so here's the image from the Florentine Codex, where you can see one of the more glaring examples where I've highlighted these for you. These are the passages that have been corrected, mirroring what I mentioned with the fables. You can see how they correct particular items in the manuscripts. And then the concept of erasure is really critical, understanding why they made these corrections in the first place. This is the Codex Boterini, one of the earliest manuscripts we have. It's on fig bark paper, indigenous paper, all mostly pictorial elements, mostly visual language. What my colleague Angela Raja Galpolan has argued is that this type of manuscript, the Tlacuilos were working out how to correct or keep this history alive. They had a white paint they were using to cover over portions and change things, and these included really fine ghost lines. You can still see the manuscript here, the ghost lines, little red lines. They would disconnect certain dates from each other. Really fine, but it's really important to do these studies on erasure. She argues that because we can find these, it shows how original this moment was for them to create this history, create this archive. They actually needed to make changes right on the fly. It's not a copy of something else. They were creating the history on the page in front of you. Just to highlight one of the other volumes that I've been working on in Mexico, these are changes to economic understandings of the world. These are changes to ownership, political ownership. You can see corrections in this particular local record of who owns what in the area. These are maps showing people's particular names. They've whitened out this person, this turtle person. They've covered over the smoking symbols for the figure that used to be owning that land. These are changes that are happening in real time in the 1540s, and then they're captured in this type of manuscript. And just to show you just a taste of what the publications are going to look at, identifying where the corpus changes, we see in the Toledo manuscripts the use of the white material, and in our Cambridge manuscript the use of no use of white material. So in some ways, it could have been that these were done either at the same time or by different authors who, one is not as comfortable using the language or writing the material. Knowing that I can create a concordance among these manuscripts is really important. We see that they use a particular, called a disfracismo, a way of describing Jesus. You're made in your son, adding more of a kind of a community sense to who he is, who he represents, instead of what we see, what may have been underneath that original manuscript. All right, so just to conclude, finish up, we can have some questions. I hope this talk has shown the importance of doing this type of work, both the visual analysis and the lab work. You can't just have it all be digitized and studied by a machine. It's really important to have people, have conversations with conservationists, curators in the room. At least that's my experience. The need for working across disciplines, the importance of having understanding of the language and working with communities to understand the language. Some of the larger revelations that our manuscript is extremely unique. The Bible Society's collection is extremely important for that reason. That this is an undocumented technology that needs to be surfaced more. We need to understand the European roots and why these two flew together, have a confluence together in Mesoamerica in such a prominent way. And especially the legacies of the Tlacuilo and how their writing tradition lives on in a Christian manuscript, and then how these liquid correctives are forgotten about. Like why did they show up in the first place? What happens in human cognitions to sort of find the need for this corrective choice on either side of the Atlantic in roughly the 13th century or so, maybe give or take a few hundred years. And then why does it stop being used? Is it something with print culture? Is it something with typeset being an easy way in which we might navigate a manuscript? The final sort of big questions for me: how do we reclaim these types of technologies, other types of technologies that show up in manuscripts? What more can be revealed when we study these manuscripts? And also how the impact that it has on Christianity in the 19th century. Understanding that you'll see how Thompson adopts Nahuatl writing systems in his own research. For all of his negative comments about the extinction of a particular language, it really did resonate with him, and he became fascinated with his culture. So the way that collections can help us sort of change, diversify our thinking itself. In the end, you might have a question of whether this is an indigenous thing or a Spanish thing, a European text, and there's this sort of this divide, this sort of separation between what we might think of one culture or another. One thing that's really important to keep in mind is it was a Christian text. We know that they were trying to affect the Christian identity. We know that because they gave us a clue, and that's because there was a Jesus fish stuck in there the whole time. So just in case you were wondering, that's left in there for us. So that's my little talk there. Thank you for your time, everyone. It's been really great.